On the morning of April 26, 1986, the world changed, but no one knew it yet. In a quiet corner of the Soviet Union, deep inside a nuclear power plant, a test went terribly wrong. What followed was not just a reactor explosion, it was a human disaster. Thousands would be exposed to radiation, entire cities would be emptied, and a silence would fall that lasted for decades. This is not a story of fear, but of truth. Of the workers who stayed behind, of the families who were never told, of the scientists who tried to understand what went wrong. Chernobyl was not just a Soviet event. Its lessons echo around the world even today. In the next few minutes, we walk through history, step by step. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was located near the city of Pripyat in the Ukrainian SSR, about 130 kilometers north of Kyiv. It consisted of 4 RBMK 1000 nuclear reactors. Construction of the plant began in 1970. Reactor 1 was completed in 1977, followed by Reactor 2 in 1978, Reactor 3 in 1981, and Reactor 4 in 1983. 2 more reactors, Units 5 and 6, were under construction at the time of the accident. The RBMK 1000 reactor was a Soviet-designed high-power channel-type reactor. It used graphite as a moderator and light water as a coolant. The RBMK design had a known flaw, a positive void coefficient. This meant the reactor could become unstable at low power. The plant employed thousands of workers and provided electricity to large parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Near the plant was the city of Pripyat, built in 1970 to house plant workers and their families. Pripyat had a population of around 49,000 at the time of the disaster. The city included schools, hospitals, shops, cultural centers, and amusement parks. On April 25, 1986, a safety test was scheduled at Reactor 4. The goal was to determine if, during a power outage, the turbine generator could power essential systems until backup generators started. This test had failed during 3 previous attempts. The test required reducing reactor power to around 700 MW thermal. At 1:00 p.m. on April 25, the process of lowering power began. At 2:00 p.m., the Kyiv power grid requested continued energy output, delaying the test. Operators held the reactor at 1,600 MW for several hours. At 11:04 p.m., permission was granted to resume the test. By then, the night shift had taken over. This crew was less experienced with the test procedure. Power dropped too low, down to 30 MW thermal, due to a buildup of xenon-135. To raise the power, operators withdrew most of the reactor's control rods. Automatic shutdown systems were disabled to prevent interference. This violated multiple safety regulations. Power was stabilized at 200 megawatts, still far below the intended level. Coolant flow remained high, further destabilizing conditions. At 1:23:04 a.m. on April 26, operators began the test. The turbine was allowed to spin down, cutting power to the coolant pumps. This caused steam voids to form in the cooling channels. The RBMK's positive void coefficient caused reactivity to rise rapidly. At 1:23:40, the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button was pressed. This inserted all control rods into the core, but the rods had graphite tips, which initially increased reactivity. Within seconds, power surged uncontrollably. At 1:23:44, the reactor exploded. A second explosion followed moments later. The core was destroyed. The 2,000-ton upper biological shield was blown off. Radioactive material, graphite blocks, and fuel were ejected into the atmosphere. Fire broke out on the roof and inside the reactor building. Radiation levels at the site exceeded 30,000 Roentgen per hour. Lethal exposure occurred within minutes. Control room operators initially believed a hydrogen tank had exploded. They did not realize the core was exposed. A general fire alarm was declared. Fire brigades from Pripyat and nearby towns responded within minutes. Most responders had no knowledge of radiation hazards. They wore standard firefighting gear, not protective suits. They climbed onto the roof to extinguish graphite fires. Several picked up highly radioactive debris with their hands. By morning, dozens of workers and firefighters showed symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. These included vomiting, dizziness, and burns. Over 130 people were hospitalized in the first 24 hours. 28 individuals died from radiation exposure within the first 3 weeks. These included plant staff, security personnel, and emergency responders. One plant worker died from injuries sustained in the explosion. Fire Chief Volodymyr Pravik led the first response team and died shortly after. Pravik was only 23 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Pripyat's residents were not immediately informed of the reactor accident. The city functioned normally throughout April 26. Radiation levels in Pripyat were more than 1.0 times above normal. Children played outside while radioactive dust settled. On the morning of April 27, evacuation orders were issued. 1,200 buses were brought in from Kyiv and other areas. At 2:00 p.m., evacuation began. Residents were told they would return in a few days. Most never returned. Within 3.5 hours, 49,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat. In the following weeks, 116,000 more people were evacuated from within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Over time, more than 200,000 people were relocated from contaminated areas in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Helicopters dropped sand, boron, dolomite, clay, and lead into the reactor to extinguish fires and absorb radiation. Over 5,000 metric tons of materials were dropped in total. Miners were brought in to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4. They installed a heat exchanger to prevent melted fuel from reaching groundwater. Conditions were extremely hazardous. Miners worked in 50°C temperatures without respirators or adequate clothing. A concrete sarcophagus was constructed over Reactor 4 to contain radiation. It was completed in November 1986. The structure was built quickly and developed cracks over time. Lethal exposure occurred within minutes. The Chernobyl explosion released large quantities of radioactive isotopes into the environment. These included iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239. Approximately 520 petabecquerels of radioactivity were released. Radioactive particles were carried by wind across Europe. Sweden was the first to detect abnormal radiation levels outside the USSR. Fallout reached parts of Scandinavia, Central Europe, and as far as the UK. Contaminated milk and crops were found across affected regions. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR, confirmed 31 direct deaths. The World Health Organization estimated up to 4,000 long-term cancer deaths among high-exposure groups. These included liquidators, evacuees, and residents of highly contaminated zones. Over 600,000 people participated in cleanup operations. Liquidators included firefighters, soldiers, construction workers, and scientists. About 240,000 liquidators worked in the most hazardous period. 1,986, 1,987. An estimated 5,000 thyroid cancer cases occurred among children in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Early cases were attributed to contaminated milk consumption. The Red Forest, located near the plant, received the highest dose of radiation. Trees turned reddish-brown and died within hours. An initial Soviet commission blamed operator error for the disaster. The international community later identified deeper causes. A 1771 IAEA report cited multiple failures, design flaws in the RBMK reactor, inadequate operator training, poor safety culture within the Soviet nuclear industry, disabling of safety systems, lack of containment structures. The accident was rated level 7, the highest on the International Nuclear Event Scale. 6 plant officials were convicted of gross violations of safety regulations. They received prison sentences of up to 10 years. The disaster prompted reforms in Soviet nuclear policy. Gorbachev acknowledged the accident eroded public trust. The incident contributed to glasnost and ultimately the Soviet Union's collapse. Chernobyl remains the worst nuclear accident in history in terms of cost and health impact. It caused an estimated $235 billion in damages. Reactor 3 continued operation until 2000. After the Soviet collapse, the site became the responsibility of Ukraine. In 2016, a new safe confinement was placed over the sarcophagus. The structure cost $2.1 billion and was funded by an international consortium. It is designed to last at least 100 years. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone remains in place. It is monitored by the State Agency of Ukraine on exclusion zone management. Some wildlife populations have increased due to the lack of human activity. Controlled tourism is allowed in certain areas. Chernobyl changed global nuclear safety protocols. It led to the creation of the World Association of Nuclear Operators. Design standards, emergency training, and transparency have improved worldwide. The disaster remains a subject of scientific study, policy change, and historical reflection. It demonstrated the critical importance of design safety, regulation, and transparent governance in nuclear energy. Chernobyl left behind more than ruins. It left behind questions about safety, about responsibility, and about truth. In the years that followed, scientists studied, policies changed, and a new generation grew up asking what really happened. Some parts of the exclusion zone are alive again, not with people, but with forests, animals, and silence. The story of Chernobyl is still being written in medical studies, in environmental reports, in families that still remember. It reminds us what happens when warning signs are ignored, but also what people can endure when everything falls apart. This story is for you, and for the world that must remember.